Okay, fantastic. Yes, welcome along everyone to the fifth Academic Literacies webinar. The focus on this theme is professional identities, and we've welcomed along two guest speakers. We're very lucky to have two speakers today. And so we'll start with our presentation from Michelle, who I'll introduce in a moment. After that, we'll follow straight on with a presentation from Kevin. And then, as always, we like to finish with an opportunity for us all to have a discussion on the points and the themes that were raised in the presentations. So we will go into breakout rooms, and I've got some question prompts to help guide discussions in breakout rooms. So we're scheduled, I think, to go on to 1:30, but obviously I think 1 o'clock will be thinking about rounding off, and if people need to leave for other commitments, that's fine. So that is the plan for today. So we'll start off with Michelle Joubert, who I will welcome now. Michelle Joubert is the head of the Academic Language and Literacy Development Unit, which is embedded in the Centre for Teaching and Learning at the University of Free State in South Africa. She's also worked in the EAP field in the United Kingdom and is currently completing her PhD in the field of academic literacy. Her research interests include AL practitioner identity, curriculum development, multilingualism, and decoloniality, which is, I struggled with that pronunciation earlier, in AL development work. So I will let her, I'll hand over to her now to introduce her presentation. There we go, Michelle. Is that okay for you to share the screen? Oh, hey, Michelle, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. All right. I was just saying, sorry, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for giving me the platform to talk today. And thanks very much to Angelos and Emily for inviting me as well, and for organizing the session. I'm really going to jump straight into it because I only have 10 minutes, and I do have quite a lot to unpack, and I'm also not a woman of few words. So here's my attempt at condensing my PhD into 10 minutes. All right. So the research that I'm going to present to you today comes from my PhD, which I'm currently finishing up. And my research question, or my main research question, is in what ways do EAP practitioners in the higher education sector construct and reconstruct their identity and therefore agency in a marginalized space in light of structural and cultural forces that affect it? So it's quite a whopper of a question. And to explore this question, I've used a qualitative methodology, and I've been interviewing a number of practitioners from different institutions in South Africa. My aim really with this research was to start challenging the dominant common sense discourses about the remedial nature of EAP in South Africa in order to more accurately reflect the activities of practitioners and of the research-informed nature of the field. By not engaging with issues such as this, we risk pushing the field and its practitioners further away from the center or from the academe, making it more susceptible to sub-degree work status, as well as to outsourcing and also the denigration of expertise, which may have significant impact on student access and success. So essentially, it's an attempt at gaining more cultural capital, so as to, and then I'm going to quote Ding and Bruce here from their 2017 publication, so as to exert influence in academia and to occupy a less marginal and vulnerable disposable position. Now, EAP in South Africa has a mixed history, which I don't really have much time to get into. So what I'd like to just highlight for this presentation is that from the very beginning, so from around about the 1980s, when academic development, as a field started to grow, and EAP under that, it and its practitioners were positioned in a peripheral space outside the mainstream academic curriculum. Historical shifts in how EAP is perceived has brought about a long-lasting tension in the development of EAP practitioner identity, in the sense that there is a clear divide between EAP being positioned as an academic endeavor versus EAP being positioned purely as a support service. To add to this is South Africa's continued socio-economic inequality, which extends into the schooling system, and which means that EAP work is still often understood as remedial rather than integral to student success. So what I'd like to highlight here, and just for this presentation, is the fact that, and sorry for the blurriness of the image there, is the fact that the South African higher education system is still very much divided in two. So there's the academic space with academics in that space on the one side, and kind of everything else, or the non-academic support services, professional services, whatever you choose to call it, all of those people kind of lumped together on the other side. And the issue with this binary is that EAP practitioners never fully occupy the academic nor the support spaces. Added to this is the fact that there were a range of positionings and related understandings of EAP in South Africa. So it makes it difficult to categorize EAP as either belonging to the academic space or to the support space. Sorry, just going to move my notes. Although most permanently employed practitioners in South Africa are on academic contracts, so they are junior lecturers, senior lecturers, associate professors, etc., there is still a marginalization of them because of institutional perceptions of EAP work as being remedial or kind of pre-university only. So practitioners on academic contracts, for example, and this is data that I got from my participants, they're perceived as being lesser academics, or, you know, not real academics, is what some of
streets, like knocking the barricades over the people, the Chinese people. Yeah,
I think someone's microphone is on. Sorry. Okay, so yeah, practitioners on academic contracts are seen as being lesser academics or not real academics, which is something my participants commented on. And those on support contracts are seen as being kind of fixers of a problem. People talk about the language problem, and I'm putting that in air quotes very specifically. It's kind of similar to the ways in which maintenance people come in to fix the aircon. And this was a comment from one of my participants. So the traditional fix-it view of EAP. So in general, there was agreement from our participants that they constantly feel that they need to prove their worth, prove their value, prove their expertise, and convince other academics or the institution at large, top management, etc., of that worth. So what I'm essentially arguing is that this binary understanding of the spaces that we constitute, or that constitute higher education, are not useful and are no longer relevant, and that instead of occupying one space or another, we do inhabit and should inhabit both spaces in different ways. But because this binary view of higher education is still so prevalent here, there is no other kind of official or recognized space for EAP practitioners to claim or make their own. So we never, you know, we're never fully in one space or in another. And that's why I argue we occupy this liminal space. Just a quick note on my use of liminality. I'm not drawing on anthropologists such as Mayer and Land or Thomason, who link liminality to the concept of passing through thresholds, but rather I'm using the dictionary definition of the term, which is really just to mean a space of betwixtness or betweenness. And my aim has been to capture the reflection of EAP practitioners on how they shift between identities and between these different spaces in the institution. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about my theoretical framework, but just very, very briefly, I'm using Margaret Archer's social realist framework. The data that I'm presenting in this presentation is not so much my sort of theorized version of my data, but I found her framework very useful. Her analytical separation of structure, culture, and agency has been useful in trying to understand EAP practitioners' experiences of how certain structures and cultures have helped to shape their professional identity. And just a quick note on the definitions. Structures are any rules or systems, resources and allocation, while cultures are the values, beliefs, ideas, and paradigms that surround EAP. So this is the figure where I'm trying to bring all of my data together. The yellow area represents the core attributes that my participants value and which impact the most on their construction of a professional EAP identity. So the first is the ability to be protean. Many of my participants spoke about the importance of being able to shapeshift, and I'm playing here on Kevin's title, not shapeshift, but shapeshift here, according to the needs of students, academic staff, institutional strategic prerogatives, etc. And they need to be able to constantly shapeshift or be protean in order to remain relevant and legitimate within their spaces. This is combined with the willingness to learn, a constant willingness to learn, because of the meta nature of EAP. I'm using one of my participants' term here, the meta nature, in that we need to insert ourselves into a variety of different disciplinary literacies. And so we very much work in between a number of different disciplines. And additionally, there's the persistence and resilience are core attributes, especially when faced with constraining institutional and broader environmental structures and cultures, such as the massification of EAP. At my own institution, for example, we have over 11,000 students enrolled in our EAP modules, and linked to that, the impact of employment precarity. So to use my own institution as an example again, we have about 100 precariously employed EAP practitioners. Now, these four attributes and the value attached to them seem to be the cornerstones needed by anyone wishing to enter into and kind of remain in the EAP profession within the South African landscape. And without them, it seems that practitioners would struggle to construct a firm professional identity and enact their agency within their institutional spaces. Now, at the center of this yellow area is EAP practitioner, professional identity. That's the gray purplish circle in the middle, and surrounding it are the key aspects that to varying degrees impact upon the construction and reconstruction of that identity. Now, I'm only going to pay attention to three of them for the sake of time. I'm happy to discuss the others during the discussion, but the first is what I'm calling the cultural positionality of practitioners in their institutions, which plays a major role in the way they are able to enact their agency and construct a professional identity. And by cultural, I mean the way that EAP is perceived in institutions, and the fact that those not working in EAP, so other academic staff, often see it as a butler service, to use Rames's term, or as a remedial form of support that can take place in a very short amount of time, and also at a distance from the main traditional academic curriculum. So even if practitioners are on academic contracts, I spoke to an associate professor, for example, his cultural positioning, which is linked to this perception of the work that he does, is still a much more powerful and impactful force that marginalizes him, practitioners like him, and the work they do, pushing them out of the center and back out towards the periphery of the institution. The second way in which EAP practitioners construct a professional identity is through doing and producing research and building their own research profile. So by doing this, practitioners show their understanding of the kinds of knowledge production that are valued in the higher education space, and they use that to further legitimize the work that they do. The importance that practitioners place on the production of research also plays a role in how they construct their professional identity as specialists or experts in the field of academic literacy development. And then finally, collaboration with other academics, as well as the formation of, communities of practice, such as, Bali, or we've got Heltas in South Africa, SALP, etc. These kinds of communities of practice are two aspects that really stood out in my research in terms of how practitioners are able to construct an identity and cement the legitimacy and the value of the work that they do. So much so that I've come to believe now that the only way for EAP to survive or thrive in an institution is through collaborative work and through collaborative efforts with other academics. So bringing this all together in my conclusion very quickly is that the legitimization of the liminal space, as well as shifting these often ill-informed or just incorrect cultural understandings of EAP, are not easy tasks. One of my participants, for example, speaks about it as changing people's hearts and minds. And in order to do this, practitioners need to, as I said earlier, work collaboratively with each other and academic staff to take advantage of the communities of practice that have been established over the years, so as to shift institutional understandings of the importance of EAP and the development work that we do. In the South African landscape, I've also started to notice a change in the tides, and I think it's specifically linked to COVID, which shone a very harsh spotlight on students' language and literacy needs. But basically, the changing of the tides is really characterized by practitioners playing a more central role in student development. More and more academic staff are coming to us as a unit and asking for assistance to train them in how to kind of help their students develop academic literacies through their modular content. It's also practitioners working more closely with other academic staff, conscientizing them about the complexity and value of literacies development from multiple angles, and in so doing, moving ourselves from the periphery to the center. And then lastly, I've noticed there are practitioners fighting much harder, generally through research, for the legitimization of their space. And that's it for me. That's really my research sort of condensed into 10 minutes. I hope it made sense and that I didn't miss anything major.
That's fantastic, Michelle. No, thank you so much. That was a lightning tour, but I think it came across really, really clearly. And I mean, already people are posting in the chat the familiarity with hearing what you're saying and people's own situations and experience. But I think seeing it, seeing the framework in which you presented it really helps to clarify that. We will take some questions now for Michelle. So there's some questions coming up in the chat, but feel free to put your hand up as well. The first question, Michelle, from Amanda is, we can perhaps kickstart with this, is to what extent is EAP outsourced in South Africa in terms of the private providers? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so through I've worked with a couple of practitioners from different institutions in the public higher education space. It's not outsourced to a massive extent. In fact, I'd say there's very little outsourcing of EAP work in the South African higher education, the public higher education landscape. There is, I've noticed, because it concerns me, but I've noticed an increase in use of, for example, Pearson and Macmillan have reading programs that one of my participants, for example, at his institution, the top management wanted to buy it and use it, and he fought the good fight to say, you know, it needs to be embedded in the discipline, it needs to be more discipline specific, catered towards our students and their needs, etc. And he happened to win that fight. But there is more and more of that going on, but it's not to the same extent that it is in the UK, which I'm grateful for. I think that's one of the things that I realized through my research is that I think structurally, many institutions are getting it right, but it's the cultural aspect of it. It's that perception that still is a very powerful force, and that affects the construction of our identities. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Any other questions? Feel free to post in the chat or pop your hands up. I can see everybody. If not, I might have one more question while we're waiting, Michelle, because I was just thinking, just to be devil's advocate here, is there any way to look at this liminal space positively as a kind of beneficial space to occupy in terms of what we're trying to achieve in our roles? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there is some positivity in it. I actually draw on our she's here today. Maguzata Juniak, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name, but I came across a presentation of yours and it got me thinking about this sort of freedom in the margins as well. I think that's how you phrase it in your research. So I think there is that, but largely if I can use my own institution as an example, it's taken us about 2 years just to make the argument and get buy-in for us to actually have academic promotions criteria. So for the longest time, we were on academic contracts, but following support promotions criteria, and the two just didn't match. It was very, very difficult to get promotions and all of that. So I think there is some freedom, but I think there's more constraints than there are enablements, if I can use Archer's terminology here, or at least through my research, speaking to practitioners, it's more of a, especially those being positioned within the support space, seems to be a more constraining space than an enabling one. But yeah.
Thank you. I think I can recognize what you're saying. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I think we're going to move on to Kevin now, just in the interest of time. Thank you so much, Michelle, but there will be an opportunity as well for further discussion after Kevin's presentation. We're going to move on to Kevin Haines now. Kevin is the Deputy Director at the Centre for Academic Language and Development at the University of Bristol. His research focuses on the experiences of academics and students in international classrooms and English medium instruction settings. And taking a narrative approach, he's looked in particular at the development of identities in relation to language and at socialization into academic communities. So over to you, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. I hope I've managed to get my microphone working as well. I've started giving little preambles to my talks just to sort of give you a little bit of context to what I'm thinking about and to give you the idea of what is the point of this. So in this talk, I'd like to discuss several ways in which I've worked with professional colleagues and students over the years to create understandings of their identity work. Sometimes those would be new understandings. This is what I consider sifting. Now, I did think about using shape-shifting, and when I Googled it, it looked quite dramatic and quite scary. So I decided that maybe shape-shifting was rather dramatic for what I'm describing, and that we would be shifting more occasionally, and actually we're sifting all the time. So we're constantly sifting. I'll come back to that. Anyway, I think the sifting is more subtle, and what I'm describing is something which people are often not sufficiently aware of. So I'm going to be thinking of ways in which we can help people become more aware of the way the professional identities grow and emerge over time, and the way that they can maybe influence through getting agency, influence the organizations in which they're working. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of sifting. I don't think it's one way of doing this. I think it works if it leads to some kind of development in people, some kind of change or greater understanding. It might only be a greater understanding in the mind of that person, or that may be transferred to others in a more collaborative way, as Michelle has just said. And obviously that would be my preference if it would actually become something of a collaborative effort, in which case that might also lead to positive changes in the learning environment for our students. Okay, so just to tie down identity a little bit, because it's such a broad and often vague term. Firstly, to use Wenger to say identity formation is a lifelong process. So I've very much focused on the process and very much focused on the fact that the world around us is changing, we are changing, everything's in flux. And Bamba has also said more or less the same thing. It's a fluid process. So in my previous slide, you could see the tide coming in and out, and every time the tide comes in, maybe the environment changes ever so slightly, and sometimes those of us in the environment don't recognize those changes. Other times the changes are only too obvious. We see it here again in terms of changing contexts. My tree is hidden in the mist and I can see the main trunk and the branches, but as the mist clears, I start to get a clearer vision of the smaller branches and the twigs. So the whole comes into focus, and I might become focused on the minutiae, whereas I could only see the trunk in the beginning. Things change, we're in transition, and our identities are in transition, just as our professional roles are in transition. So we sift our identities in EAP and in other academic pursuits and endeavours. To sift, literally, the dictionary definition is to examine something thoroughly so as to isolate that which is most important. And what I'm saying is that what is most important will change. So at different moments in our days, different things become more important than others. And I think we all learned to do this when we were children, to try and respond appropriately depending on what the role is that we're playing. And our professional lives really depend on us trying to understand ourselves as beings with all kinds of different capacities and capabilities, and we're trying to find out the best way to apply those capabilities and competences within the environments within which we work. Very often the environments within which we work have very strong ideas about who we are and what we should be doing and what an EAP practitioner does and should not do, and so on and so forth, as we all know. Okay, I did some shape sifting myself over the years. I did spend 3 years in the medical faculty, or actually the University Medical Centre of the university I was working at previously. And when we did that, one of the great things about that role was I was supporting medical professionals in understanding their role as a teacher, which was very interesting, trying to unravel what teaching is and what different capacities teaching involves compared to being a surgeon or being an anaesthetist or whatever these people were. They were highly confident people in terms of their medical roles, much less confident in terms of their teaching identities, but very willing to admit that very often. So that was very interesting. And we used Harden and Crosby 2000 to unwrap that. So when I started work at CALD here in Bristol, the Centre for Academic Language and Development, I sort of had a look at this again. I was sifting through some of my old papers as I'd moved from the Netherlands to Britain. And this was one of the papers I'd put on one side as something which had really influenced the way I worked in a particular way. So we tried this out with our colleagues and we talked about the different roles we play at different moments. And I am aware that talking about roles is not the same as talking about identities, but on the other hand, the two things are very closely tied, because changes in roles will kind of assume that your identity may undergo some kind of sift or shift through that process. Or when you move from medical education back into EAP, as Kevin Haines did, that may include various sifts. So what we did with our colleagues here at CALD was to give them a blank sheet of paper like this and to say, okay, so, do you recognize the roles on the left, which were developed by Harden and Crosby with medical education in mind? How would that transfer? And are there other roles you play in your day-to-day practice in EAP mostly, although we have a lot of colleagues here in the centre who are teaching other subjects as well. Very often this is to do with the roles that are embedded in pedagogy and didactics in general, aren't they, as you can see there. So this presentation is about me trying out various things with people to get the idea of identity and identity change on the table, and then to allow them to investigate that in more detail. So this was literally what we did with our colleagues. You would recognize this as a typical sort of workshop approach, which ended up with people really really unwrapping what they do on a daily basis. And maybe, you know, if you've got your teacher identity as your primary role most of the time, whatever that is, there may be other identities. I will talk about a research identity as well. And this is to move on now, to think about this in terms of affiliation and discourse. I was very influenced by the work of Ros Ivanich at University of Lancaster, and she was very much building on activity theory and talking about the value of practice and practices. So again, that's the collaboration, I think, that you put the emphasis on there, Michelle. I'm also very influenced by Indigenous art in Australia, like this one, which is Panchiti, Mary McLean's Everything Happens Today. And sometimes in the Centre for Academic Language and Development, it seems like everything happens today as well. And I'm sure that's exactly the same in the centres where you're working. Narrative is the tool that I've used with people to unwrap their experience at a level of identity. Labov has explained narrative evaluation by saying it's to do with comparing what might have happened but did not happen with what did in fact happen. So one example of my work with students on their professional identity, medical students, was this, where they went on placements abroad, and we looked into the idea of what they were gaining from these placements and how it was affecting their idea of themselves as medical doctors or future medical doctors. These were fifth-year medical students. And Maya said, for instance, some doctors don't interact with the patients. We're taught all the time that a patient is not a disease, but you can get really wrapped up in the disease and how fascinating it is. And I really felt like, oh, that would be my nightmare to be that kind of doctor. I'll never be that kind of doctor. I will always invest in my patients. So we were getting a strong feeling of the identity that Maya would like to have within her future profession as a doctor. And the narrative was helping us her to compare that identity with other possible identities which she didn't want to take on board. So I've taken that approach and I've used it several times over the years, most recently with Yoram Taru Sarira, who is a conflict management specialist, an academic from Zimbabwe. And Yoram and I worked together during lockdown, interviewing successful colleagues within our university in the Netherlands. And one of the things that we observed is we're all sometimes to some extent insiders and we're all sometimes to some extent outsiders. So we investigated this experience. We wanted to discover how the experience of being an insider and an outsider at the same time contributed to their professional identity and impacted on their sense of belonging. Again, a narrative approach. Sophia told us in terms of language, colleagues whose native language is neither Dutch nor English struggle because they're always at a disadvantage. Their voices are not always heard. And the idea of the language police looms. Jonah told us, matters of inclusion and exclusion are experiential. People feel exclusion and brokenness. So you can see that this approach really gets inside people's experience and they're really expressing these what we called modes of belonging. But we then moved on from modes of belonging to modes of engagement. And people talked about how they express their identity in positive ways. Remember, we interviewed successful academics, people who were doing well. And the people doing well were struggling a lot. They had an internal struggle, but they also had developed strategies like assertiveness, as described by Jonah. So talking about professional identities, there are many different ways of mapping professional identities and presenting it to other people so that you get a better feel for who you're working with. You get a better idea of how collaboration might work when you're moving in a certain direction on certain projects. So Wim Penny and colleagues have written about this, and they've also used mapping as a way of getting people to express identity, to depict identity, and they published some examples that came out of a project they were working on. So people mapped their identities, and when people map their identities, you get a huge variety of results. So we tried this in CALD. And I can't share the actual product because that would be too private and personal or confidential. But what we did see again was a huge variety of depictions of people's identities, from diagrams to mind maps to geographical maps to trees with all kinds of branches. As I showed you earlier, the tree seems to be a strong metaphor. The landscape is a strong metaphor. Mountains, where are you? Are you still on base camp in whatever your endeavor you're busy with, or are you near the peak? Where are you, and where are the other people that you're cooperating with? Somebody did a lovely drawing of their bookcase, and then people presented themselves as learners and teachers. I'm not just teaching, but I'm learning as I'm teaching. I'm learning through teaching. I'm learning to teach, and teachers and researchers. So the last connection brings me to my final slide, which is about the way that we've taken a structural approach to trying to encourage people to own their researcher identity within our centre. So in other words, people tended to have a strong feeling that they were not allowed to be researchers, or they could not be researchers because they were being positioned as teachers in a non-research community. So what we've been working on most recently is this research and publications project, which has produced several articles which will be published in various places during the autumn and the winter this year. And also I've put a link there to our blog, because what we found out was that it's very good to have stepping stones. Stepping stones seem to lower the threshold and make it easier for people to move forward with the process. They don't have the feeling, if you remember those sticks I showed you at the beginning, they don't have the feeling that they already have to aim for the sticks way out there in the distance, but they can take things one step at a time and actually achieve things. And I think that's such an important expression of someone's identity. So here are a few examples of the blogs that have been published this summer within our centre, and which are available for people to look at, and they're representative of the kind of work that we think we're doing with people's identities when we encourage them to take on these researcher identities alongside their teaching identities. And we're seeing really positive examples of people taking that research knowledge and transferring it back into the education. So I think that's where I want to finish with my references here, and thanking you for your time and stopping within my 10 to 15 minutes. I'll stop sharing, shall I?
Thank you, Kevin. That was fantastic. Again, really, really well presented, and lots of really interesting things I've never thought about in ways and methodologies I've never considered before as well, with the narrative approach and the mapping, really things I'd like to know more about. We've got things coming up in the chat already. Someone's just commented that what you're talking about is evocative of Indigenous identity in New Zealand with Maori. I don't know if you're familiar with Maori culture. I can't pronounce Turangawaiwai, referring to the place to stand one's mountain. I mean, you've referred to other various kind of narrative storytelling and cultural identities, Kevin, in your research. Could you speak a little bit more on that, that relationship?
I think metaphors are really strong ways of unlocking ourselves, because it's a way of kind of distancing ourselves from the locked-in reality, you know, where you're in a organization, and the organization has all these constraints and limitations, and it's trying to make you into a certain type of person, certain type of professional. And of course, you buy into that to a large extent, and that's also part of your identity. But you're also a person who brings something special to that process, and we're trying to find out what that is. So by using those metaphors and the narrative, you can step outside of the sort of someone's everyday understanding of themselves and allow them to sort of imagine their way forward. So this idea of imagining your way forward is very important. And I've also used that a lot with students as well, where you think you can't get them to reflect very easily on what they're doing now because it's too close. But if you let them reflect backwards and then let them reflect forwards again, they'll often be able to imagine their way into the future. And that's what I was doing with those those medical students as well, was giving them a gentle run up, really. And it's very important to be able to step outside of those limitations and constraints, but while at the same time recognizing very seriously that those limitations and constraints really exist, and that they're real, but that doesn't stop us imagining other things. And sometimes the imagination is what allows you to take a step forward. And I think that's what I believe in very strongly, yes.
Well, actually, just building on that, because it was occurring to me as I was listening to your presentation, I mean, you're focusing on practitioner identity, whether you've done any comparison with student identity, because some of those similar findings around feeling like excluded, part of a community, sort of resonate with what I've read about student identity or identities, particularly studying outside of your first language and those things. Had you done any comparisons?
I haven't literally done comparisons between the students and professionals or teachers later in their career, but I've done work on language socialization and the value of language, the socialization into language as a way of entering into learning communities. So I'm very interested in the ideas of communities of practice. So I'm drawing on Wenger, but within Wenger, you've got this idea that it's the practice that is really pivotal, and that's what Ivanic brings in as well. So I'm really thinking about what it is that makes students able, or enables or empowers them to become part of, active members of a learning community, rather than sort of being on the edge and peripheral to that process. And the way I've done that in the past is also a narrative approach, getting them to tell their stories. There's a very good methodology with language learning histories that there was somebody called Murphy, actually. It's Murphy's work, going way back to the turn of the century, I think. And the idea with language learning histories was that you could get students to talk about their language experiences from a positive and a less positive point of view, and then think about the way that fed into their current language experience, and discuss that with their teachers. And that would often be an eye-opener for the teacher, because the teacher would have a better understanding of literally where the student was coming from, rather than seeing them as a point in time student in the class. So I think at the beginning of the presentation, I put a focus on process and on change, and both those things are very important. So we're in these processes. The processes are constantly changing. Someone in the chat said, the medical relationship has also changed. So everything is shifting. And, the last few years, obviously, we've had these immense changes, which nobody expected, but often the changes are much more subtle, and it's much harder to draw them out of people if you just interview them and say to them, okay, so what's happening? Rather than saying, write a reflection, and then we'll have a focus group. And in the focus group, you can mention something they've reflected on and say, well, what do you mean? And then you say to somebody else, yeah, and did you experience this the same way? And you start building a story, and that's the narrative, which is also collaborative.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Michelle and Kevin. I'd really like, because I'm sure we've had so much information, we're all kind of buzzing in our minds. I'd like to give us time now to go into breakout rooms to discuss some of these themes. Thank you so much, though, Michelle and Kevin, for your wonderful presentations. There's a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure that your themes were resonating with a lot of us. As usual, everyone, what we do at this point is we open up breakout rooms, and there is a discussion document, which I will put in the chat, just with some prompt questions around this theme of professional identity. So feel free to use this document to help guide your discussions in the breakout rooms. Or just feel free to comment on Michelle and Kevin's presentations and what they've been talking about. We'll be in there for about 10 minutes just to kind of feed back to each other and share our thoughts and ideas around this theme, and then we'll come back together and finish off. So I will open the breakout rooms now for those 10 minutes. Right. Okay, there we go. I'll stop recording as well.